wildfires continue to burn out of control this morning on the Avalon Peninsula.
A wildfire on Vancouver Island has forced hundreds of residents out of their homes.
Severe drought is putting farmers' livelihoods at risk.
Temperatures reaching well into the 30s.
We continue to see some of the worst air quality on the planet.
The effects cannot be denied. This has been a hot, dry, and smoky summer. The climate is changing, but is there the political will to stop it? I'm David Thurton, sitting in for Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, can Canada meet its climate goals?
There's a lot of things in this world that are uncertain at this time, but I think it's a safe prediction, David, that we will not meet that target.
We have a range of perspectives, from a climate scientist who tracks emissions to a former top public servant from natural resources, plus activists, a former political staffer, and a voice from the energy sector. We're asking, should Canada come clean and admit we won't meet our climate targets? This special edition of The House is now in session. This summer across Canada, people have been feeling the heat and struggling with smoke. Some live in buildings without air conditioning that are too hot. Others don't have homes at all. So let's head first to the edges of the climate emergency.
On days that are particularly hot, we separate the city into almost boroughs. The team then packs their car with as much water as they can. So, 4 or 5 cases at times.
Michaela Tachaloskis is the Outreach and Housing Services Manager with the Salvation Army in Ottawa. At times, she's sort of a first responder for those feeling the impacts of severe weather. Today, it's a group of people hanging out on the sidewalk as the concrete and asphalt around them lock in the day's heat.
We like to check in every now and then just to make sure everyone's doing okay. Jade, if you want to go ask to make sure if anyone needs water.
It's a quick stop, then it's back on the road. Just tell us, how difficult has it been with the heat?
It interacts poorly at times with folks who are intoxicated, which is not the majority of our clients by any means, but it is concerning when we're responding to what we think are overdoses, but they're heat-related medical emergencies. And it can be really tricky to appropriately respond in those medical situations. So there's that component. Another component is finding individuals who are in harder to serve areas. So anything outside of the downtown core does not have many drop-ins or shelter locations to sit in air conditioning or to get water. And that can be tricky to find and locate them and provide water, food, juice sometimes. To be honest with you, 40 degrees for 2 weeks, I'm grumpy. The clients, anyone who I think spends most of their day outside is going to hate it. And the increase, I wouldn't call it aggression per se, but the increase in frustrations about people's life situations, about the temperature, we see drastically increase over those days.
One of today's clients is Mama Cat. This summer's heat has been tough on her.
It's really, there's no way to calm down, to cool off, And especially if you're homeless, it's not like we can just jump into a shower and, or a pool or anything like that, right? So, yeah, it's not good, right?
We head to an encampment near the river.
One of the things I do think is important to note is that we walk past a splash pad. A lot of people bring families, children, splash pads. It's very successful at beating the heat. But they're not permitted. I get the protection of children very, very important. I think it's something that we do need to consider is, can we mimic the infrastructure that already exists to support folks who may be unhoused?
Michaela and Jade check the tent that's been set up by the splash pad.
No one is there. What we do when we don't see anybody at an encampment, we always make a point to leave something behind. So we left 4 waters right now. There is a water bowl, so I would assume there's an animal. We see lots of dogs with unhoused populations. So we left all 4 water bottles. We will come back later in an attempt to engage with the clients in that tent to support long-term housing solutions, but also just to check in to make sure they're doing okay.
The Salvation Army is fighting on two fronts, an addiction crisis and a housing crisis. But the worry is both will get harder as the planet faces extreme heat and extreme cold. 10 years ago, the world came together in Paris to set out a path to reduce the emissions that are causing climate change. Canada's target? At least 40% below 2005 levels. But will we meet that goal? Simon Donner is the federal government's top climate advisor, co-chairing the independent net zero advisory body. He's also a climate scientist and professor at the University of British Columbia. Simon, welcome to the House.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Simon, are we going to meet our 2030 climate targets?
It's highly unlikely that we can. Canada has been doing better than ever at reducing emissions. You know, the emissions are down, according to the latest data, 8% from 2005 levels. And that is a real accomplishment. But to get to that 40% or ideally 45% reduction target by the year 2030 is going to take a really heavy lift at this point. And it's going to be hard to get there given that so far, all we know that is happening that we've been removing existing climate policies like the consumer-facing carbon price.
And how far off are we?
So according to the government modeling, and this was while the consumer carbon price was still in place, if all of the policies worked exactly as intended, we could get to maybe a 36% reduction by the year 2030. That would be a big accomplishment and not that far from the target. But that is what happens if all the policies are actually implemented and they actually work as intended. And so it is a really kind of the upper bar of what's potentially possible. But given that we've removed the consumer-facing carbon price and we don't yet know about the strengthening of some existing policies like the industrial pricing system, and we don't know the status of some policies that haven't been finalized, like the oil and gas emissions cap, it's highly unlikely we will come even close to that 36% that the government models produced.
So it sounds like there's lots of uncertainty there, but what is certain is that we're not going to meet our targets. Why is that?
You know, it basically, we started working on this a little bit too late, to be honest. And it is still remotely possible that, again, if we were aggressive in the implementation of all of the announced policies that were announced under the previous government, and we went ahead with, the advice of our advisory body and others like the Canadian Climate Institute to tighten the industrial pricing system, we could get closer to the target. But it's going to take a lot of political will, and it's going to take a lot of effort in negotiating with the provinces, because in many cases, these are federal policies, but they are actually implemented by the provinces. And so we really depend on those negotiations.
Let's talk about oil and gas. They make up about 30% of our emissions. What has the industry done?
Well, the oil and gas sector is the one sector in Canada where emissions have not been declining, right? And the major reason for that is the oil sands sector, is that emissions in the oil sands, they more than doubled since 2005, and they're now responsible for a significant piece of Canada's national emissions. And if you discounted oil and gas emissions, Canada would be, getting close to halfway to its 2030 target. The problem is just not enough has happened in the oil and gas sector. There's been some progress, at least in reducing methane emissions within oil and gas, and that's been an area of progress. But overall, it is the sort of one of the main blocks, the oil and gas sector, to us achieving our emissions targets.
You were mentioning the consumer carbon tax. How much did scrapping the carbon tax affect our ability to meet our targets?
Well, according to research from the Canadian Climate Institute, the consumer carbon price was an important but smaller potential contributor emissions reduction. So it might have gotten us 7% of the way to the 2030 target. So it was a small but important player. I think the thing that we need to take into account right now is we've removed one climate policy that was part of this sort of architecture that we had built, right? And people across the country, industries, et cetera, are trying to call for cutting other policies. They're saying, well, we're not sure about the oil and gas cap, or we don't like the EV mandates. But you can't just keep removing pieces, out of the Jenga tower. Eventually, the whole tower is going to collapse. The question we need to ask ourselves is, if we're going to change a policy, and certainly if you want to remove one, what are you going to replace it with? And will the replacement be as efficient and as cheap as the ones that we've already designed? And I think what you realize when you start doing the research on this is there's a reason that the policies have been chosen and designed the way they are. They, for the most part, were efficient ways to get to emissions reductions. They just need to be tweaked to be more effective.
How does Canada's performance compare to other countries?
So if you compare us to our G7 partners, Canada's lagging behind, and it may surprise people to hear this, but even the United States is far ahead in reducing emissions than Canada has been. The United States' emissions are down around 20% below 2005 levels. Now, the U.S. did have some advantages in opportunity to reduce emissions. It had an electricity grid that is very reliant on coal, and switching from coal to natural gas has resulted in a lot of emissions reductions, at least over the past 20 years. But if you look to countries in Europe, et cetera, they're all moving much faster ahead than Canada. And so one of our concerns here, working with the Net Zero Advisory Body, is making sure that Canada is not just reducing its emissions to try to combat climate change, but making sure that we're really prepared for the sort of the economy of the future. Because however it may seem, with what's happening in the Trump administration in the United States and how much they're gutting climate policy and gutting climate science, the rest of the world is charging ahead. And our concern is that Canada's not prepared enough for this. And we need to be on board with this transition to a low carbon economy that is increasingly happening in Europe and in Asia.
When you look at Canada's share of total emissions, global emissions, we're making a small dent, it seems. 1.4% is the amount of emissions we're responsible for. So just maybe, can you tell us, why is it important for Canada to still pursue emission reductions?
Right now, Canada is a very disproportionate source of greenhouse gas emissions for our population. So we emit about 9 times the emissions per person of somebody in India. And so although our total amount is only 1.4%, we are less than 0.5% of the world's population. And so we are a disproportionate source of emissions. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that this is just a collective action problem. And whenever you think about anything that requires collective action, whether it is like building roads or building bridges or making sure we have hospitals, everyone understands that no one person can do them alone and that we all need to contribute. And so this idea that gets thrown out there that Canada maybe doesn't need to do anything about climate change because we're only one small country, we don't apply that logic to any other collective action problem in the world. And so it shouldn't really apply here either.
I want to ask you about Mark Carney's promise to build, baby, build. He was elected on a campaign to do that big and to do that fast. The government will be choosing projects that it deems to be in the national interest, and an oil pipeline could be on that list. So how could that impact our climate targets and where we're heading?
The idea of investing in big projects and building infrastructure to sort of develop the Canadian economy for the future, given what's happening in the U.S., it's a great idea, and I'm fully in support of that. But we just want to make sure that the things we're investing in are really the economies of the future and not the economies of the past, right? And so the proposal to expand an extra oil pipeline, to build a new oil pipeline, if such a proposal actually exists, there isn't a proposal on paper right now. The question we need to ask ourselves is, do we need this in the year 2040? Like, you think about how many years something takes to get built and how long it will operate afterwards. What is the world we are entering into there? And I'm not saying that there aren't ways in which Canada can benefit from new oil pipeline, but I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, who is that oil being shipped to in the year 2040, in the year 2045, when the world is shifting away from using gasoline in passenger vehicles, for example? And so I think we just need to make sure the choices we're making now really have the long-term vision of the country and of the world in mind. We need to recognize that the world, despite what you hear from the U.S., the world is shifting towards low-carbon technologies, and make sure that Canada is taking the best advantage of that we can.
We are in the midst of a pretty bad wildfire season. We've seen a summer of intense heat. Drought is still a persistent problem. And Canada, as you said, is not on track to reach its climate target. So just can you tell us, as a climate scientist, how do you not, become pessimistic about our future and where we're heading?
I find that the climate change is not really about optimism or pessimism. I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, and so I try to find the positive stories we can. And I do think that we can see that the projections for where the world was going to be were a lot worse 10 years ago than they are today. And that's because of the moves around the world, including in North America, to shift to renewable sources of electricity and to shift our vehicles to relying on electricity and seeing a decline in the use of fossil fuels for some forms of energy. So we are seeing a transition. It's just not nearly fast enough. We're kind of on the beginner slopes. We're on the bunny slopes, and we need to get onto those double black diamonds, or the black diamonds, the really steep slopes. So for me, it's not about optimism or pessimism. It's about whether we have guts. Do we have the courage to do this? Because we have the opportunity to make choices now that will make the future better, both economically, both in terms of health, and both in terms of the environment for Canadians. But it requires us to make hard decisions and make investments now. And it's really tempting in times of stress to move back to the things we're used to doing in the past rather than invest in the stuff for the future. And that's, to me, what's important is, do we have the guts, not whether we're optimistic or pessimistic.
Simon Donner, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Simon Donner is a climate scientist and the co-chair of the government's Net Zero Advisory Body. So where are the areas that we can do better and still strive to meet our climate goals? Nicole Dusick is a senior policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I asked her, what would meeting our climate goals look like for you and me?
Electrification of transport, electrification of heating and cooling, and electrification of industrial processes. People won't really necessarily see that. But in everyday lives, what people will see is a switch to electric vehicles, a switch to electrified transit. They will see a push to have electric heating and swap out natural gas in their homes. Those are the kinds of things that will be visible to everyday Canadians.
As Dusick explains, reducing emissions requires us to ditch fossil fuels and basically electrify everything. The problem is, we need more power, and all those additional electrons need to be green.
So electricity is key, but clean electricity is key. And in Canada, we already have a fairly clean electricity grid. It is approximately 80% clean. A large chunk of that is hydroelectricity. And so we need to build out renewables, because if we are going to electrify everything across Canada, if that is key to decarbonization, which it is, what we need to do is not only get the rest of the way to clean the electricity grid up, get a net zero electricity grid, but we're actually going to have to expand it potentially 2 or 3 times. So we're really actually going to have to produce a lot more electricity. And that needs to come primarily from wind and solar.
Dave Sawyer is the Canadian Climate Institute's principal economist. He says there is a lot of buzz around solar right now.
So solar, if you look at the latest statistics, monthly statistics out of Stats Canada, solar is growing, at like 5 times the rate of the other generating sources. So batteries and solar paired together are becoming really cheap, like really cheap. And so what's hindering that is sort of political choices to constrain the rollout of that stuff. When you look to Europe and how Europe has responded in response to the Ukrainian war that drove up natural gas prices, and the rollout of solar and rooftop solar and distributed solar across households has been astounding. You see these innovations online about, people hanging solar panels off the side of their balcony and plugging them in to their plug. And they just, like a wall plug, and they just generate power.
Solar is actually really old climate tech. So is carbon capture and storage. It's a method of removing carbon dioxide pollution from fossil fuels and injecting it deep underground, where it came from. How can that play a role, especially in the oil sands? It's controversial.
It is yet to be shown that we can get real emissions reductions from CCS. It's been around for a long time, but it has not yet been implemented in a way that is showing us that it actually can reduce emissions. The things to keep in mind about CCS, though, is first of all, it's very expensive and the costs are unlikely to come down, in part because when you implement CCS, it is bespoke, it's individual, it doesn't scale the same way that other technologies like solar or wind would scale, and so you don't get the same cost reductions. So it will continue to be expensive. The other piece of it is that it could help reduce those emissions from producing oil and gas. But if you look at the whole life cycle of emissions that are emitted in producing oil and then using it, 20, perhaps 25% are in producing, and the remainder, 75 to 80% of emissions come from actually using the oil. So CCS could potentially reduce emissions, but it's reducing emissions partially in a small part of the whole emissions that we get from burning oil. So it isn't really a solution.
Sawyer says CCS was part of Jean Chrétien's climate plan and Stephen Harper's. But 30 years later, he says it's time to stop talking and start doing.
And yes, it's going to be expensive, but there's all kinds of investment tax credits from the feds. There's revenue recycling coming out of the Alberta system. There's grants. There's money to help with it. We just need to get going. And yes, it can help the problem, but it's kind of like carbon capture utilization is like the goalie. And there's all this other stuff, like there's defense and there's back checkers, and we're not looking at that stuff. So there are other options that can reduce emissions somewhat and get going. And so we're sort of focused on having no team on the field and just a goalie. And we're letting in a lot of goals.
I'm David Thurton, and you're listening to a special edition of The House, looking at whether Canada will fall short of meeting its 2030 climate goals. There are many people who've worked on policies that could edge us closer to our targets. Serge Dupont is a former top public servant. He was a deputy minister and advised the Privy Council office on the TMX pipeline, as well as electrification projects in Atlantic Canada. He's seen what it's like to try and make climate aspirations a political reality. He's now the head of the public policy group at Bennett Jones. Welcome to the House.
Thank you very much, David. Pleasure to be here.
Canada has pledged to reduce emissions by at least 40% by 2030. What's your view? Can we meet that goal?
There's a lot of things in this world that are uncertain at this time, but I think it's a safe prediction, David, that we will not meet that target. There's another 35% to go. It will not happen between now and 2030. I think that's as close as a safe prediction as one can make.
And why is that in your view?
There's political wins, geopolitical wins against the effort right now. There was already, a struggle to get there. The targets were perhaps overly ambitious to start with. So you put all that together, we're definitely going to come short. I think it's still important we make a valiant effort to go as far as we can, but we're not going to meet that target.
Are you saying Canada's net zero goal is too aspirational, Serge?
It is certainly aspirational. And I think when you said aspirational, you kind of already have said it. But, the 40 to 45% by 2030 was what basically the experts considered we needed to get to in order to have net zero by 2050 in view. Now, net zero will remain an aspirational target to the extent that it is referenced at all. You notice we're hearing a bit less about net zero the last little while.
We are, but is it too aspirational, would you say?
I think that where a target becomes too aspirational, it becomes when it's simply not credible or not believable. And I think it's probably close to that. I am not certainly the definitive authority on what's feasible and not feasible by 2050, but it is certainly a stretch. And when you stretch it too far and it becomes unbelievable, then it's harder to mobilize, to achieve a target.
So how would you suggest that we recalibrate?
Well, first, I think, one of the great successes we had in policy in Canada was the deficit reduction under Paul Martin. And what Paul Martin decided to do at a point in time, everybody wanted to have a balanced budget, said, let's hang on, we're going to go 3% of GDP, and we're going to have 2-year rolling targets. And we're going to meet these targets come hell or high water. So there was a target that was set within a horizon that there were enough controls to see whether we were going to hit it, and then if we weren't, we could adjust. But to have it too far out in the future, you can always kind of push things off, and eventually we'll get to it, and then some measures are going to have some bite later. So I think you would need to establish a more credible 5-year target, let's say, and have an annual process of review where we are, what correctives we need to take. But fundamentally, you need the political will supported by the public will to get that effort done. And perhaps that's where there's been a bit of a disconnect. These targets were established, but not necessarily really fully bought into by the Canadian public.
Does the planet have time for us to slow down and to recalibrate and to adjust?
That's a sound question. It is perhaps a lot to put on the shoulders of Canadians. I mean, at the end of the day, we're 1.4% of emissions worldwide. So what we do isn't going to be consequential that much to whether, the planet will burn or not. We obviously have a part to play, but we can only control, as the Prime Minister sometimes say, we can only control what we control. There are some economic limits to what you can do in terms of abatement of emissions. There's some technological limits. There are some real political limits. And perhaps those are the ones that have been most underestimated as we set these targets, is the extent to which the public would be willing to go along, perhaps pay a little extra for their oil or gas that they use for their heating or for their cars. And, politicians cannot do miracles. I mean, they have to set targets, mobilize the population to the extent they can. But that's a process. And we obviously have to recalibrate now, to my mind anyway.
But climate change has its costs. We're seeing that with forest fires. We're seeing that with other natural disasters. Can we afford to slow down?
Globally, we cannot. But this is the problem of the commons, as they call it, David. Is that as Canada, am I going to be the one to say, for example, I am actually going to lower my production or constrain my production of oil and gas because I consider that the planet really has a challenge and we have to contain our emissions. And if I do that and others go on and they produce that oil and gas and they sell to those markets, then I've not necessarily accomplished anything for the planet, but I've constrained my economic growth. So there's no real substitute here for a collective response to this, but the collective is the global. I'm not saying that absent that you decide you just let it all rip. But you'll have to be very sensible about what you're doing, what costs it implies for you, what benefit it implies in terms of your perhaps greater, economic or environmental security, whatnot. But you'll have to be a bit more calculated than saying, okay, there is an emergency. I have to react as if there is an emergency, and this is going to condition my every behavior. There's a wider set of issues at play here for Canadians.
Canada, of course, has made international obligations through the UN climate process. What happens if we don't meet those commitments, in your view?
Well, it's not good from a diplomatic point of view. That's the target we talked about, which is 40-45% by 2030. That's the interim target. We're not going to meet that. In fact, in 2025, under the Paris Agreement, we'll have to establish a new target, which, as per the treaty, is supposed to be more ambitious. So I think that with Mr. Carney's government, we'll have to basically come clean in 2025 and say, here's the new target, and may not be more ambitious in terms of GHG reductions. But there is no legal economic sanction that happens with this, David. And I don't say that.
But do you think there could be consequences with our allies, the EU and the UK and other G7 partners?
There could be. For example, with the EU, it could say, listen, if Canada's not meeting its targets, doesn't seem to be taking this very seriously, we'll actually start to, restrict access to our market. And in fact, they're already starting down this path with what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where they when they import certain products, they'll determine whether there's the carbon content of it is consistent with their regulations. And if you're not, then you can actually lose the market access. So you're quite right. There can be some consequences, unlikely consequences south of our border right now, because they're certainly not taking the agreement seriously. And again, I'm not saying this, David, to be flippant about it. These are serious questions, and they should be part of the public debate. But at the same time, for us to decide we're not going to produce more oil, we're not going to produce more LNG, when the demand for those commodities is not yet plateaued internationally. Despite the Paris Agreement and everything else, the demand for oil is still rising. It may plateau between now and 2030. Demand for natural gas, LNG, is rising. Again, may perhaps plateau around 2030. And so, would we exclude ourselves from these markets in order to achieve domestic targets when we could perhaps lower global emissions through our supply? That's a lot to ask. So I think these things have to be part of the conversation, and those facts should be on the table, and Canadians should have a good discussion about them.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, it was a pleasure, David.
Serge Dupont is the former Deputy Minister of Natural Resources. It's known that Canada is warming at twice the global average and up to 3 times faster up north. And so the idea of adjusting targets to make them more realistic is appalling to some.
Yeah, so I have 2 bottles of graffiti, one hot pink and one black. And I gotta put on my mask because the fumes are quite something.
Near the LRT tracks in Ottawa, a small group of climate activists are leaving their mark, spray painting their logo and slogans on an underpass. So that's the logo, right?
Yes. It's a burning tree.
What's the strategy here?
It's a question of reiteration and getting through to people. It takes a while to remember the name Last Generation, but if you've seen that shade of pink 10 times, then maybe it'll stick.
Ulili Resink-Babillon is a member of Last Generation. It's a climate action group that uses civil disobedience. Think protests, paint, blocking roads to try to get the government to act on climate change. In March, Ulili spray-painted a Tesla showroom pink, for example. We met up with the group on a warm weekday evening in Ottawa. Here's Benjamin Welchner, another member of Last Generation.
Right now, we have a lot of posters that we have printed. We're going to be putting them up around the University of Ottawa. We have a big mural, like 6 feet long, maybe 8 feet high, and we're hoping that this is going to get our name out there and teach people that they can fight the climate crisis directly instead of relying on politicians who have failed us time and time again.
Using homemade glue to paste posters around the University of Ottawa campus, the main message: fix the climate crisis now.
So what you do is you do one layer on the bottom so that it sticks, and then one layer up top to kind of cover it from the rain. So I'm just warning you, the wheat paste is very gross. It gets absolutely everywhere. It's liquidy. It smells bad, but it gets the job done. Yeah.
The posters say things like, "This heat is killing us," and "Oil kills," in bright pink letters. There are about 7 people out with Last Generation this night. Their specific ask is for the creation of a national climate disaster agency, but the methods, particularly the spray painting, are illegal, potentially affecting their future prospects. I asked Ulili and her friends why it was important for them to do this.
It's the best way to deal with climate anxiety, at least for me. I really like to poster. It gives me a little bit of a sense of control over the wide aspect of the climate crisis, and it gets people in the streets, it gets people to our events.
The climate crisis, it gives me a lot of anxiety, and being involved in a group like this, it's an outlet, I guess, and it feels good to take action to meet like-minded people.
You mentioned climate anxiety. It's a term that some people might not be familiar with. How would you describe that feeling?
I don't know, like an existential dread. Just seeing we just had a heat wave where it was like 40 degrees and humid, and right after that we had some smoke, and we used to not have like back-to-back heat waves here in Ottawa, and the smoke is a new phenomenon as well. And to me, it's just like a glaring reminder, like in my face, that we need to do something.
What do you think is at stake here if we don't hit our climate targets?
I mean, the future. I try to be level-headed in my analysis, but the science has been clear for a long time that this is the direction that the freight train is heading in, is a pretty dystopian outlook on the future.
It's not just the homemade glue that drips from these posters. These activists ooze distrust for today's politicians. I asked Ben if he had any hope for Mark Carney, given his past work on climate change.
Starting with getting rid of the consumer carbon tax sort of set the tone for what Carney was looking to do for that. And I think in the last 5-10 years, it's been made abundantly clear that if we get real climate solutions, they are coming from ordinary people instead of coming from the government.
I think what is frustrating is that it's not something that's coming up every day for him. I think that we know the climate crisis is knocking on our door. We're seeing it outside. Yesterday it was very smoky, and it's just unfortunate that that's not reflected, or that same urgency is not reflected in our policymakers.
He's only been Prime Minister for a couple of months. Do you think we need to give him more time?
Maybe. But I think that what we need is civil disobedience. I think that is a really essential part of our democracy, a cornerstone. It's what's gotten us so many of our rights. And so I think that, we can give him more time, but I think that the climate crisis is inching closer and closer. So I think that us ordinary people need to find a way to, put a little bit of pressure on him and get him to act more urgently,
But disobedience sometimes comes at a cost. Postering and spray painting are minor infractions, but Ulali has been arrested twice, something that could come with real consequences, including a criminal record. As we walk along the path beside the LRT to the latest spray paint spot, I ask why she feels it's worth the risk.
There is a very high likelihood of arrest, and every time you contemplate arrest, you know that the chances of you getting a criminal record increase. But for me, the risk of inaction is far greater than the risk of taking action. So when I look, I have a really hard time contemplating my future, just knowing the science and knowing what that looks like for the world and what we're living right now, and thinking that that's just the beginning. To me, it's worth it. If I do end up having children, I want to be able to look at them in the eye and say, I tried, I don't want to be having any regrets about I was too afraid of taking action or any of those residual fears, because to me, it's just a core value of words are all talk, but taking action, that really means something.
So, hearing that, I wanted to ask Mark Carney's new Environment Minister if there was still the political will for Canada to meet its 2030 climate targets. We requested an interview with Julie DeBruzen. Her office said she was not available. In a statement, DeBruzen's press secretary says Canada is committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and, quote, taking into account the evolving global and economic context, the federal government will provide an update on its emissions reductions plan as we strive towards our 2030 and 2035 targets. So, to discuss where Mark Carney stands on Canada's Paris targets, 2 points of view. Oliver Anderson was the Director of Communications to the former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. He's now with the water charity Aqua Action. Shannon Joseph is an Energy Forum Fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She's also the chair of Energy for a Secure Future based in Calgary. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Shannon, according to polling, Canadians still care about climate change, but it's dropped on the political agenda. Why do you think it's become less of a priority?
I think that, when Prime Minister Trudeau was in the height of his mandate, the focus, like his everything policy, was climate. It was the economic policy, it was the foreign policy, it was the housing policy. And it turns out that that's not the best way necessarily to have an economic policy or a foreign policy or a trade policy. And we see from the OECD and other reports, Canada's fallen behind economically on GDP per capita. People feel the pinch. And so they've changed the priorities. And I think we're going to end up with a better, more measured solution because of it.
Does the political will still exist on this issue, Oliver?
I think it does. I mean, we know that the Prime Minister is somebody who is deeply committed to this issue, having served as the special envoy to the UN on climate. And I think that he's been clearly elected on a mandate for economic growth and to build projects. I think that there's a process of recalibration right now. We need to resolve the issue of the United States trade negotiations. But there's going to be a way forward for us to still arrive at some of those same outcomes and maybe just get to it a bit of a different way. And probably that's going to be more through investment, economic measures, fiscal measures. I mean, right now we're working with many new trade partners, or we're reactivating those relationships. Many of those trade partners do prioritize clean economic growth as well. So there is definitely going to be a way for us to do this.
And Shannon, is there the political will, or are you seeing something different here?
I guess I don't look at it in terms of political will. I look at it more in terms of, did we have the right approach in the first place? Were we looking at this the right way? You know, the Paris targets that we had set for ourselves was based on the idea that every country would reduce their emissions by a certain amount, and that would bring down global emissions and address the kind of global issue. But because not every country has the energy it needs, and it relies on energy trading partners, when Canada, which happens to have a lot of energy, takes an approach that maybe winds down oil and gas, which many of the policies we had been pursuing were not helpful to us having a growing industry. We kind of put our allies in a position, and this certainly happened in 2022, where we can't get them extra energy when they try to decouple from Russia. And so they all end up burning more coal. Like Asia burned more coal. 2023 and 2024 had the record use of this highest emitting fuel. And so I think Canada needs to develop a strategy where it looks not only within our own borders, but thinks strategically about how our energy can help other countries address their energy security and their emission goals. And I think that will also raise our standing in the world, and that is an important thing for us to be thinking about.
Oliver, you were in the room. Did the former government get the strategy wrong here?
Well, I think that it's a blend of different regulatory approaches, financial approaches, fiscal approaches that have always been the defining, I think will be the defining legacy of the Trudeau government. And many of those, were successful. We have moved forward on a lot of different, we've made significant progress on meeting our climate objectives. Remember, our emissions are now down 8.5% below 2005 levels. So we have actually successfully bent the curve on emissions. So in that respect, yes, they were successful. Are there areas where they can be improved? Of course. Are there areas where we can look at perhaps new measures based on the new current context that we face? Absolutely. And I think that there's going to be a lot of scope for the government to do that in a way that will be able to bring on board the sort of national unity with provinces and Canadians alike in a recalibration of industrial strategy.
Before he was Prime Minister, Mark Carney's views on climate change were well known. He was the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, as you mentioned. As Prime Minister, his first action was cutting the carbon tax, though. Do we really know where he stands when it comes to meeting Canada's climate goals?
We know that he's somebody who's deeply committed to the realities of a changing climate and what's needed to ensure we're building out cleaner, renewable energy as much as possible, supporting Canadians and workers alike when we do it. I think that is kind of the defining challenge of our time. We, I think, are in a situation now, again, where he was clearly elected on a mandate to deal with the United States' trade negotiations, and that is sort of the first priority for him, and to build out our infrastructure nationally. And as he's right now also working with bureaucracy to ensure that they, reduce spending internally, that we find a new recalibration of industrial strategy, which is going to work to get us to our goals. We haven't seen that they're prepared to abandon any goals right now. We want to see what it is that they are going to change in order to still get us to that end, and perhaps through different kinds of tools. It's more of a focus on the outcome than the specific tools themselves.
How about you, Shannon? Do we have any signals on where Carney stands on his approach to tackling climate change, or is it relatively unknown right now?
I think the most important direction Prime Minister Carney has come out with is build, baby, built. And it couldn't have come, sooner. I think that to me is a message of he might still have a commitment to the climate agenda of the previous government, but he recognizes that we need to diversify our trade. We now want to spend more on defense. We want to grow our economy and not be second last in the OECD on GDP per capita. What is that going to take? And I think that takes balancing all of these policy goals together in a way that the costs and benefits work for us. I think we can't forget that before the last election, the agriculture sector was sounding the alarm about how expensive some of these policies made the fuels they needed as a key input for production. The manufacturers, the chemistry folks, of course, oil and gas and others were sounding the alarm. We are losing capital. And I don't think those calls were taken seriously before. I think Prime Minister Carney is now paying attention. And the fact that he wants to build is fundamental because every province in the country needs more electricity. British Columbia, Hydro Province, imports energy. And for the last 3 years, it's been importing U.S. electricity, which is coal power, and sometimes gas power made from gas that we ship them. And so there have been some real gaps. And we need to really think about how are we going to build the things we need to do any of these things. And I'm glad it's now a serious priority.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, I just want to stay with that build, baby, build agenda that Carney has.
Yes.
Just, part of that agenda is supporting an oil pipeline, something I would imagine your organization is not against. So how does Carney thread that needle? How does he thread that needle while still trying to bring about this massive reduction in emissions that Canada needs to bring about?
I mean, he threads that needle first looking at what is this going to do for jobs and opportunity in Canada? What is this going to do for economic reconciliation opportunities in Canada? I think, the story that's happened with First Nations who are owners on the Coastal GasLink pipeline and who have been kind of major collaborators in LNG Canada, who are majority owners in Cedar LNG. I think there's exciting opportunities for build out of this economic reconciliation agenda alongside this broader Canadian economic agenda. That's a thread he has to thread. And, on the emissions question, I think we go back to, a point I made earlier, which is he is talking to global leaders, right? We just hosted the G7, and a lot of his peers do not have the energy they need. And Russia is still able to fight its war because it is finding ways to sell its 10 million barrels a day of oil around the world. Can Canada displace that? We could. Would that be good for geopolitical security? It would. Would it be better on emissions? You betcha. I'd put Canada's environmental record against Russia's any day of the week. Do our allies need it, whether it's Asia or Europe? Yes, they asked us for this. And so I think this is a bigger strategic thing.
I wanted also just to add that, I feel that some of the debate around building pipelines is a lot of overheated rhetoric. Firstly, your guest referenced projects, for example, Cedar, wood fiber, LNG. These are projects that are getting built currently. And we don't have a specific project that's actually being proposed at the moment. And what Canadians, I think, are going to be hopeful to see is a build out of kind of the clean and renewable infrastructure that we know will be viable for generations while helping us to bring down the emissions to make the world more livable for our kids and grandkids. That's the ultimate goal. We are in a unique time right now where we're building out our trade relations with non-U.S. partners. And again, our 10 largest non-U.S. trade partners have policies favoring low carbon inputs, low carbon imports, and have net zero commitments. So we have a massive opportunity to build out our supply chains that are going to be supporting clean energy, critical minerals, clean technologies. Making those kinds of investments is good for the long term and will ensure that we're building out assets that are here to stay. And so I think that there's actually a lot of opportunity. We don't need to pit the environmental imperative, the clean growth imperative against economic gain, because in fact, there's a lot of opportunity, especially as the U.S. has sort of ceded the ground to us in terms of the tax incentives that are in place to support that. It makes Canada an increasingly more attractive destination for foreign investment in terms of our resources that we have to support those kinds of the growth in those industries. So I think we should be looking really hard at doubling down in terms of the growth in the clean and renewable supply chains that are actually going to be more dominant through the latter half, particularly of the 21st century.
Okay, folks, this was a great discussion. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks.
Shannon Joseph is the chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Oliver Anderson was the former director of communications to Stephen Guilbeault. That's it for us today. Next week, our summer specials continue. CBC's defense correspondent Murray Brewster will be in the host chair with a look at Canada's changing security relationship with the United States. Our crew in the house is Kristen Everson, Emma Godmere, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. I'm David Thurton. Thanks for listening.